There is a real working system inside major companies that quietly decides you will never be hired again, and most people never find out until every application just disappears into silence. A little while back, a video about hidden do not hire tracking inside a well-known employer spread fast, leaving people asking the same three questions. Is this real? How does someone end up flagged? And how do you get off it? Today, I'm walking you through how this works from the inside, clearing up what's conspiracy and what's genuine mechanics, and showing you exactly what puts your name on that list. Hey, welcome back. I'm Dre. I've spent years sitting in recruiting rooms, comp planning meetings, and the kind of closed-door conversations where decisions about candidates actually get made. This channel exists to pull back the curtain on that stuff: career strategy, hiring mechanics, workplace politics, the parts of the process nobody explains to you. Because most career advice out there is written by people who've never actually been in the room. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe, because we get into this every week. Here's the first thing people get wrong. When they hear do not hire lists, they picture an actual spreadsheet somewhere with your name on it, maybe even shared between companies like some kind of credit report for job seekers. That's not really how it functions. In most applicant tracking systems, there's no dedicated blacklist tab sitting off to the side. What exists instead is a status field attached to your candidate profile, and that status quietly follows you through every job you apply for at that company, sometimes for years. It's not dramatic. It's just a note, a code, a flag, buried in a system most candidates will never see the inside of. But functionally, it does exactly what people assume the mythical list does. It makes sure you never get another callback, without anyone ever telling you why. To understand how you actually end up there, you need to understand how candidates typically get sorted after an interview loop. In systems I've worked with, there are usually three outcomes. The first is straightforward. You get the offer, and none of this applies to you. The second is what I'd call a reconsider later status. This means you didn't do anything disqualifying, you just weren't quite the right fit for that specific role. Maybe you were missing one skill or 1 year of experience. Recruiters will often attach an informal waiting period to that status, sometimes without ever telling you it exists. And the idea is that once that window closes, you're free to apply again with a clean slate. That window isn't standard either. It can be a few months for a junior role or closer to a year for something more senior. And it usually depends on how specific the gap was. Honestly, this is the most common outcome for candidates who don't get the job. It doesn't mean the door is closed. It just means it's closed for now. The third outcome is the one you don't want, and that's a permanent do not reconsider flag. Once that's attached to your profile, it usually applies across every team and every open role at that company, not just the one you originally applied for. Every recruiter who pulls up your file can see it, and most of them won't bother explaining why they're passing on you. So what actually earns you that permanent flag? Let's get into it. Rarely does a failed technical or skills assessment alone get you permanently flagged, unless there's clear evidence you tried to cheat your way through it, using an outside tool or another person to feed you answers in real time. That kind of thing tends to end an interview process immediately, and it gets documented in detail. More often, the permanent flag comes from the behavioral side of the interview, when an answer you give directly conflicts with how the company defines its core values or standards of conduct. These moments are rarer than people assume, but when they happen, they usually get written down close to word for word and attached permanently to your file. Reneging on an accepted offer is another one. If you've confirmed a start date and then back out at the last minute, especially without giving any notice, that gets logged too, and it tends to stick for a long time. The same goes for no showing a scheduled interview, even something as small as a phone screen. Missing it without a heads up sends a clear signal to a hiring team about how you'll treat their time later, and that note travels with your profile to every other opening you apply for down the line. There's a related concept worth separating out here because people mix the two up constantly, and that's rehire eligibility. If you used to work somewhere and left, your exit usually gets coded with a simple eligible or not eligible for rehire status inside the HR system, completely separate from any candidate side flag. This one is often more mechanical than judgmental. It can get triggered by a performance issue, but it can just as easily get triggered by something administrative, like not giving proper notice or a manager simply defaulting to not eligible out of habit rather than any real grievance. The problem is that status usually isn't reviewed again unless someone actively challenges it, so it can sit there indefinitely, quietly blocking you from ever being considered for a return, long after the actual reason behind it stopped mattering to anyone. One more wrinkle worth knowing. These flags aren't necessarily permanent in a technical sense, even when they're described that way. Companies go through mergers, system migrations, and platform overhauls fairly regularly, and applicant tracking data doesn't always survive the jump cleanly. Sometimes a flag gets carried over intact. Sometimes it gets dropped entirely because nobody mapped that specific field to the new system. There's no way to know which one applies to you from the outside, and I wouldn't build a strategy around hoping for the second option. But it does explain why some people find themselves unexpectedly back in consideration at a company that once went completely silent on them. Here's a beat that catches people off guard. Recruiters and hiring managers usually aren't the only people whose impressions matter in this process. In a lot of companies, how you treat the front desk staff, the person walking you around a facility, or the coordinator scheduling your travel and interview times gets fed straight back to the recruiting team. If you're dismissive, demanding, or difficult with anyone in that process, it's often reported and it can end your candidacy on the spot, sometimes without the actual interview panel ever knowing the real reason the process quietly stopped moving. Misrepresenting your background is another quiet one. Inflating a title, rounding up years of experience, or claiming ownership of work that wasn't really yours. When that gets caught in a background check or a reference call after an offer's already been extended, it doesn't just cost you the job. It usually gets documented as a credibility issue rather than a simple mismatch, and that label tends to follow you further than a normal rejection would. There's one more trigger worth naming, and it's less about behavior and more about optics. Applying to dozens of unrelated roles at the same company in a short window doesn't read as enthusiasm from the inside, it reads as desperation. When a recruiter opens your profile and sees applications scattered across departments that have nothing to do with each other, the usual read is that no single team wants you, so you're throwing applications at anything open. That pattern alone can quietly get you deprioritized, even if nothing you did was technically wrong. Quick note here, because this touches on real employment practices, none of this is legal advice, and how candidate data gets stored, shared, or retained varies by company and by jurisdiction. If you have genuine concerns about how you were treated in a hiring process, that's a conversation for an employment attorney, not a video essay. Now let's clear up the biggest misconception, because the comments on this topic always go here. People assume there's some industry-wide blacklist that gets shared between competing companies. In my experience, that's usually not true, and I want to be direct about that. Recruiters at competing companies generally aren't coordinating against individual candidates. We don't have the time, the incentive, or, honestly, much interest in doing that. A bad experience with one candidate usually gets noted internally and then forgotten, not broadcast to a rival employer down the street. What's far more likely is that you're flagged at one specific company, sometimes even just one division of it, because of one hiring manager's experience with you. Where it can get murkier is informal reference checking. When a recruiter happens to personally know someone at your previous company and makes a quick off-the-record call before moving you forward. That does happen, but it's usually tied to a specific relationship between two people, not some coordinated system. And it's far less common than candidates tend to assume when their search suddenly goes quiet. There are two rare exceptions worth naming, though. If your conduct became genuinely public, something serious enough to be searchable and permanently tied to your name, that can follow you across an entire industry. And a documented safety violation with real, verifiable consequences can do the same. But those are edge cases. They are not the norm. And most people reading into a string of rejections are not dealing with either one. So how do you actually know if you're on one of these lists? You're not going to get a notification. No recruiter is going to message you and say you've been permanently flagged, because most of them were never told to. What you might notice instead are patterns. Getting rejected within an hour or two of applying, more than once, at the same company, may be a signal worth paying attention to. Getting rejected even faster each time you reapply, sometimes within minutes, is often a stronger one. Applications that sit in a generic under review status for months without ever moving, while similar roles at the same company keep getting filled, can be another quiet indicator. So can getting the exact same rejection wording, down to the sentence, across completely different job families, which usually points to an automated triage step filtering you out before a person ever looks at your application. And if you were previously active in a company's hiring process, maybe you even made it to an interview and then suddenly can't get a single callback no matter what you apply for. That combination is usually worth taking seriously. So what can you actually do about it? You're probably not going to erase whatever status is attached to your profile at that specific company, and chasing that isn't a great use of your energy. What matters more is what you do going forward. Stop mass applying. Be selective and stay consistent with the type of role and level you're actually going for, so your activity tells a coherent story instead of looking scattered to anyone reviewing it. It's also worth being honest with yourself about how you've shown up in past processes, not just with interviewers, but with everyone you interacted with along the way, since that's usually the part people underestimate. It's also worth a quick self-check on anything publicly visible tied to your name, since some recruiters will glance at a public profile or a comment history before moving you forward. And an old, heated exchange with a former employer or recruiter sitting in public view can color that first impression before you ever get the chance to explain it yourself. If you think you've been flagged somewhere you genuinely want to work, your best move usually isn't reapplying cold. It's building a real relationship with someone on that hiring team first, so you come in through a referral instead of the general pipeline. It's not a guarantee, but it's the most realistic path back in that I've seen work. And give it time. Systems get replaced. Data doesn't always migrate cleanly, and companies do periodically clean house on old records. That's not something to count on, but it does happen more often than people assume. So here's the honest version, full circle. The do not hire list is real, but it's not the sinister, industry-wide conspiracy people imagine when they first hear about it. It's usually a handful of quiet status codes sitting in a database, and most of them get triggered by things that are genuinely within your control. Show up professionally. Treat everyone in the process with respect. Be intentional instead of scattered with your applications. And for most people, this is never something you'll actually have to think about at all. If this cleared things up, subscribe, because next week I'm getting into what actually happens to your application in the first 90 seconds after you hit submit, and it's not what most people think it is. Drop a comment if you've ever noticed a pattern like this in your own job search. I read all of them.